Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday. Thank you for sharing where you are all joining us from in the chat. If you've not already done so, please do that. We love to know where all of our learners are coming from. My name is Mackenzie Cole, and I am the Senior Associate of Community Engagement here at the Metropolitan Opera Guild. And we're really excited to host this score reading workshop this morning. Just a few things that I'm going to go over before we really begin this wonderful session. We are recording today's session, and because of that, everyone who is participating will not be able to turn on your video or your microphone. So if you do have questions, we ask you that you use the Q&A function of this webinar. If you haven't used that before, if you look toward the toolbar at the bottom, there should be a Q&A button with two speaking bubbles. You can use that to ask any questions, and we will be able to see it and get to your question. We also recommend that you use full screen mode today, just because we've got a lot to go over and we want to make sure you can see everything as clearly as possible. Toward the top of your screen, if you see a button that says View, that is where you can choose that full screen mode. We also want you to know that we have optimized all of the sound that we will be sharing on our end. So everything is already going to be shared as loud as possible. So then you on your side can control the volume, make it louder, make it softer to your own preference. And that is just what we wanted to go over today. Without further ado, I want to introduce today's lecturer, who has been hosting some wonderful sessions for us so far this season. So this will be our third score reading class with her this season, and we actually have two more coming up after that. So if you enjoy, be on the lookout for that. So I would like to introduce today Dr. Naomi Perley. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mackenzie, and welcome everyone to today's class on La Traviata. So just to follow up on those couple of housekeeping things that Mackenzie just went over, I have a couple little housekeeping things of my own. So first of all, I just want you to know that I will be sharing on my screen not only the PowerPoint slide that you see right now, but I will also be sharing on my screen the score. So when we listen to excerpts from the opera, I will have the score up on my screen shared with you, and I will be trying to follow along with my cursor as best as I can while we're listening to the score. So if you already have the score printed out or open in another window and you want to follow along with it there, you can, but you may find it easier to just follow along with the score if you've got Zoom open in full screen. And one other word about the score, the excerpts that we provided for you today are a bit more substantial than what we'll be covering in class. So in other words, there's some extra material provided in the PDF that you've got ahead of class. There's some extra material in that annotated score that we're not going to be able to get to today, unfortunately. So again, I will try to announce at the start of excerpts, what page we're on in case you're following on your own copy of the score, but you may find it easier to just follow along with me in full screen because we'll be jumping around a little bit and not exactly going through every single number that's in the annotated score. Okay. So with that little bit of housekeeping out of the way, as I said before, today we are going to be taking a look at Verdi's opera La Traviata. If you joined me for the score reading classes that we've done earlier this season so far, our previous couple of score reading classes were on Wagner's Tristan and Isolde and Beethoven's Fidelio. So we started the year with a couple of German operas, and now we are going to be doing a complete 180 and taking a look at a really classic mid-19th century Italian opera. And interestingly enough, Verdi and Wagner were actually born in the same year in 1813, but their styles developed in completely, you could say completely opposite ways, pretty much. So just a few basic biographical facts to get us kind of grounded before we start looking in more depth at Traviata. So Traviata was composed by Verdi in 1853 to a libretto by Francesco Maria Piave, and Piave was one of his most frequent collaborators for his operas, particularly in this period. And it was based on a play by Alexandre Dumas, La Dame aux Camélias. And La Dame aux Camélias had just premiered the year before as a play. So this was really an extremely current opera, and that was part of what appealed to Verdi about the subject. And the setting, originally as Verdi envisioned it, was in the present day. It was set in Paris in 1853, but he was forced by the censors for the first premiere to move the setting back a century because they thought it was just too scandalous to have it set in the current day. It was actually the first time that someone tried to set an Italian opera in the present day in real life. So, Traviata is an opera in 3 acts, and you could call it sort of a tragicomedic opera. So it has elements both of tragedy and comedy, and that's pretty much the rule for most of Verdi's operas. This is a little bit different from, again, if you were joining us for the Wagner class, Tristan and Isolde really is an epic tragedy. But Verdi is always kind of able to find, at the same time as there's something completely tragic and horrible happening to the main characters on stage, it's happening at a party with, exciting background music and so on. So when Traviata was first premiered in 1853, that original premiere in Venice was actually a complete disaster, owing mostly to the singers not being quite right for the parts, not having a lot of time to rehearse because Verdi wrote the opera very quickly over just a couple of months. But the second performance of Traviata that took place a bit over a year later in 1854 was an unequivocal success. And since that second performance, Traviata has been a staple of the opera repertoire. So this period when Traviata was being composed by Verdi was actually a period of very intense creativity that really catapulted Verdi to a new level of fame. So he was already becoming quite well known as an opera composer in the years that preceded Traviata, and then this period of 1850 to 1853 saw him write Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, and La Traviata all in very short succession. And Trovatore and Traviata especially were composed, just within months of each other, really back to back. So just to say another word about, this very, very fast pace at which Verdi is writing operas, it's a lot of work to compose an opera. They're really the largest musical form that a composer can do. So just the sheer effort of putting together that much music is really something. And to do them at the speed that Verdi was going at this point in his life is really quite astounding. And the reason Verdi was writing operas so fast was at this point in his career, he was what was known as a contract composer. So he basically just had to spend, quite a bit of time trying to get whatever contracts he could to compose operas for whichever stages would have him perform. And so as a result of that, he's constantly scrambling and trying to get new opera contract after new opera contract, and then he winds up having to, churn out operas in just a couple of months as quickly as he can so that he's able to break even and to make a living. So just one more little word before we move on. The recording that I'll be using today is the Metropolitan Opera's own recording, with James Levine conducting, Cheryl Studer as Violetta, Pavarotti as Alfredo Germont, and Juan Pons as Giorgio Germont. So if you have any questions later on, about the recording. If you want to double check that, I would say like just maybe take a note right now. If you go and search online, you should be able to find this recording. For example, it's available on Spotify, and you should be able to find it, you know, anywhere else you want to go if you want to listen to this recording again later. And one thing I'll just note about the recording, part of the reason I chose this one, is a lot of recordings of Traviata have a lot of cuts, so they might only sing, you know, part of an aria and not sing the second part that repeats, and so on. But this is a full recording, so you know all of the music that is in Traviata is in this recording. So that's one really nice thing about it. Okay, so I've just put up on this slide the main characters of Traviata, just so we can have a little bit of a brief overview of the plot. So I haven't listed all of the characters who are in Traviata, and even out of the characters that are listed on this slide, we are really going to focus particularly on 3 of the characters. So the 3 characters who we'll be hearing sing the most today are Violetta, Alfredo, and Alfredo's father, Giorgio. So just to give you a very, very short plot summary, Violetta is a consumptive courtesan. So she's sick with consumption, you know, kind of familiar in our COVID times. You know, she goes around kind of coughing all of the time. She's sick with consumption. She's a courtesan, which is basically kind of a high class version of a prostitute. And she is used to spending her days and nights basically partying her way through Paris. And of course, this lifestyle of going out and partying, you know, all day, all night, is kind of at odds with the fact that she is actually quite ill. So in the first act of Traviata, Violetta meets Alfredo Germán at a party that she's hosting, and it turns out that Alfredo has actually been in love with her for over a year and has kind of been following her around, and she hasn't really noticed, and she's never been introduced to him until this one party that she is hosting. So over the course of the party, Alfredo and Violetta get to know each other, and Alfredo basically is trying to wear down Violetta's defenses. So Violetta is, you know, presenting herself in the opening of the opera as, you know, very fun-loving and carefree, and she doesn't want to be tied down to any one man. She doesn't really believe in love. And Alfredo is, you know, trying to show her that, you know, he really loves her and he would you know, respect her and take care of her, and that they could have a future. And in the beginning, you know, she thinks that that's ridiculous, but eventually, over the course of the first act, while they're at this party together, Alfredo manages to charm her and convince her to let him come visit the next day. So fast forward to Act 2, and Alfredo and Violetta are officially an item, and they're living together in the countryside outside of Paris. But, you know, even though they're enjoying their time together out in the country, things are not exactly perfect. Neither of them has a lot of money. Violetta is selling her possessions in order to keep up their lifestyle. And when Alfredo finds this out, he goes off to Paris to try and raise some money of his own. And meanwhile, while Alfredo is off, Violetta's father, Giorgio, comes and visits Alfredo's father, Giorgio Germán, comes and visits Violetta and convinces her that she has to break off her relationship with Alfredo, or else Alfredo's sister is never going to be able to get married. So basically, you know, because there's this association between Alfredo and this courtesan, Violetta, that's really harming the whole family's reputation. So Alfredo's father convinces Violetta that she should leave Alfredo and that there's no other way. And so she leaves. Later on in Act 2, there's another big party scene. Alfredo and Violetta are at the same party. Alfredo gets into a whole card game with Violetta's protector, the Baron, and wins a whole bunch of money, and then throws all the money in Violetta's face to sort of say, you know, here, I'm paying you for your services. So it seems by the end of Act Two, like they're definitely broken up and nothing could bring them back together. And then finally in Act Three, keep in mind throughout this whole plot, Violetta is very ill and she's getting sicker and sicker. And so in Act Three, we find Violetta on her deathbed, and finally Alfredo and Violetta are able to reunite in Violetta's final moments before she dies. Okay, so that's just to give you a little bit of a brief overview of the plot. And now I want to just go over a few of the main features that we're going to be focusing on in Traviata today. And these are particularly, the musical features that we'll look at a little bit more in depth. So as I mentioned before, Traviata is a completely different style of opera from what we've been looking at so far in these score reading classes. And it really exemplifies that kind of mid-19th century classic Italian opera. So here are a few of the different things that we'll be looking at in particular in this class. So one is Verdi's use of what are called reminiscence themes. So these are musical themes that come back repeatedly in the opera and they take on a symbolic meaning. And so you can think of reminiscence themes as being sort of a precursor to Wagner's idea of the leitmotif, where he has a whole network of musical themes that basically make up the whole musical structure of the score. This is a little bit simpler. So these are just, melodic ideas that do come back a few times in the opera. However, Verdi uses far fewer of these themes than you would find, for example, in a whole network of leitmotifs, and they only come back, very occasionally over the course of the opera. And they also don't usually really change their character too much over the course of the work. They kind of sound the same every time you hear them. So we'll be looking at Verdi's use of these reminiscence themes, and that's actually what we'll start with when we look first at the prelude. And then another thing that we'll be talking about is Verdi's mastery of tinta. So this is what really set Verdi apart in this earlier period of his career. So like I was saying before, at this point in Verdi's career, he's really churning out operas as quickly as he can, working under this contract system. And so, when you're trying to get through and just write those operas as quickly as you can, you have to still find a way to differentiate a little bit the sound of one opera from the other, even though you're working within these constraints of these sort of operatic formulas, having the same kind of structure to each act and things like that. And so what really set Verdi apart from his contemporaries and initially led to his fame was his mastery of what the Italians called tinta. And tinta basically means kind of local color. So really creating a particular sonic atmosphere that's unique to that one opera that you wouldn't really hear anywhere else. So the tinta for La Traviata is the Parisian social scene. So we're going to hear a lot of dances, a lot of waltzes, that kind of sound. So we'll be looking closely at that in a number of different numbers. And the next thing we'll be looking at, and again, we'll see this right from the beginning in the prelude, Verdi is very good at using a contrast between major and minor keys to amplify emotions. So we tend, looking at Western music, particularly looking at 18th, 19th century music, we really tend to make these large overall associations between anything that's in a major key sounds happy and joyful, and anything in a minor key sounds kind of sad or angry or anxious. And Verdi really amplifies that, particularly in this opera. He uses a lot of contrast and shifting between major and minor to kind of amplify the emotions that are going on stage. And he also sometimes uses it to foreshadow events that'll happen later in the opera. So another thing I just want to note, our class is going to focus really, really heavily on Act 1 of Traviata. And I just want you to know before we get started that that is totally on purpose. Act One is really the musical and the dramatic center of this opera, and it's quite unusual in that regard. Usually we think of the first act as kind of laying the scene, and then the big, explosive scenes come later on in the opera. But I think really most of the famous music from Traviata, the music that you've heard before, probably on the radio, etc., most of that really well-known music comes from Act One. And the vocal fireworks are also in Act One. And the singing sort of gets a little bit simpler as we go on further in the opera. So we will be spending a lot of time on Act One. So just, be aware of that. I'm not just running out of time. I'm really intending to spend most of our time on Act One. And just along with what I was just saying, particularly in terms of Violetta's music, and we really will be hearing a lot of Violetta in this class, you can track a change that occurs in her singing style from the beginning of the opera when she is comparatively healthy to the end of the opera when she's dying of consumption. So in the beginning, in Act One, her music is really showy and ostentatious. There's a lot of ornamentation. Really your classic kind of Italian coloratura, show-offy kind of stuff. And as we move through from Act One to Act Two to Act Three, you'll see that her musical style gets a lot simpler and a lot more refined. And so on the one hand, I think this reflects just the reality of, as a character, she's getting sicker and sicker. So you wouldn't expect a lot of fancy coloratura coming from someone who's dying of consumption. But I also think that it speaks to the way that Verdi develops her character over the course of the opera. We start off seeing this really flashy, independent woman who doesn't need a man, doesn't need love. And as it goes on, we delve deeper into her character and start to see, really the heart behind her. And so I think, the kind of refinement of her musical character goes along with the refinement of her actual, on-stage character as well. Okay. Sorry, let me just click out of that for a second. Going to Okay, so with all that said, I am going to move on to some music now. So like I said, we are going to start with the prelude. And the prelude to Act One features two main musical ideas. So again, those reminiscence themes that I was talking about that are going to come back throughout the opera. So the first theme, the very first thing that you hear when the opera starts is, it's marked right here on the score as Violetta's death theme. So this is going to come back in Act 3, and you hear it all over the place in Act 3 as Violetta is dying. So let me just play this for you on the piano so you get a sense of what it sounds like. Okay, so that's Violetta's death theme, and we'll hear that, like I said, it's in the prelude and it comes back later in Act 3. Now I'm just scrolling down in the score so I can show you the other theme. And the other thing that we hear for the first time in the prelude is Violetta's love theme for Alfredo. Okay, so right away, that major minor contrast that I was mentioning before, you can hear in the difference between those two themes. So Violetta's death theme is in a minor key. Right? And it also is set almost like a chorale, right? So it's got this sort of religious kind of veneer to it. It sounds very, very somber. And Violetta's love theme, by contrast, is in a major key, And it also has a little bit of that sort of waltz quality. So you can, especially when we listen to the recording with the whole orchestra, you'll hear the accompaniment has that sort of pa kind of very dance-like kind of accompaniment. So one other thing that I want to point out just before we listen to the opening of the prelude is Verdi does this really interesting musical trick in terms of how he uses key signatures. So if you take a close look at the opening of this score, you will see that the key signature here is 4 sharps. So for 4 sharps, we would usually expect that the key would be either E major or C sharp minor. Now, if you take a close look at Violetta's death theme here, which is the first thing that we hear, you'll notice that in the very first chord, you can see there's an accidental, there's a D natural, and the first sound you hear is not an E major or a C sharp minor chord, it's a B minor chord. And so basically, Verdi starts off in a key that's completely different from the one that's notated in the key signature. He starts in B minor instead of starting in one of the keys that you would expect from the key signature. And you can see that means he has to use quite a few accidentals in that first line. So why is he doing this? Why is he starting in B minor instead of starting in one of the keys you would expect? The reason he's doing this is that B is the dominant, it's the 5th note of the scale of E major. And this entire opening is actually just setting up and preparing the dominant so that when we eventually move over to the key of E major, we sound really comfortable in E major. So basically, by the time we get through sort of this opening line, then we're eventually going to get to this point where we get this nice dominant sound that then is going to resolve into E major. So we get this mysterious B minor opening, which is actually preparing us to eventually switch over to E major when we get that love theme coming in. Okay, so having said that, I would like to listen to just the first bit of the prelude until we get to the love theme, and then I'm going to mention a couple other things about the love theme before we move on and finish the prelude. So now we get this sort of dominant preparation. And now we're in E major, and there's the love theme. Okay, so before we get too far into that second part of the prelude with Violetta's love theme, I just wanted to mention a couple of other details that you can pay attention to while we listen to the rest of the prelude. So the first thing is, as we listen to this initial phrase of the love theme, when we reach the end of that phrase, and you would expect to get, some kind of a cadence, maybe a little pause to round off the phrase, we don't actually get that. Instead, there are a few kind of dissonant chords that come and interrupt the serenity of this theme. And so you'll notice that. I'm just going to scroll ahead in the score a little so you can notice that. When we get to those points, you'll see they're actually circled in these big red boxes, these kind of dissonant chords that disrupt this very calm and placid love theme. And it's just a little bit of foreshadowing, that not everything is going to be super cheery in this opera. After we get this little interruption with these chords, then the love theme is going to be repeated, but there's going to be some extra ornamentation given to us by the violin. So just sort of making the melody a little bit more ornamented, a little more colorful. And again, I just want to point out, this whole waltz pattern, the papa kind of accompaniment that we get with the love theme is again setting up that tinta, that special kind of local color that, sets us right away into this kind of Parisian dance atmosphere. Okay, so I just want to point out we're on page 2 right now of the score, if you're trying to follow along on your own, and we're just going to come in on this last measure here at the top and keep listening to the love theme. So there's that dissonant chord. And now the love theme is repeating with that extra ornamentation here in the violins. Okay. So after that nice prelude, kind of setting the scene, we're going to fast forward a little bit into Act 1, and we will be listening to Libiamo Nelieti Calici, which is one of the most famous tunes from Traviata. Even if you don't think you know it, I can almost guarantee once it starts, you're going to recognize it. So just to set the scene a little bit, everybody has arrived at Violetta's apartment for a party. Alfredo and Violetta are introduced to each other for the first time, and all of the guests at the party ask Alfredo if he could provide a toast to kick off the party. They've all come and sat down at the table to have supper, and they ask Alfredo to sing a toast. And he finally agrees to do so once Violetta urges him on to give the toast. So this number again is contributing to that tinta that we started to see in the prelude, really kind of setting the scene musically, you know, getting us in this kind of atmosphere of being at a Parisian ball. So we've got a 3/8 time signature. If you just notice over here, we've got a 3/8 time signature. So we're in triple meter, which is a classic, you know, kind of meter for a waltz. And the accompaniment that we get is, again, very typical, that sort of pa-pa, pa-pa, pa-pa kind of figure. And I have to say personally, I think, you know, it's funny because Verdi does everything right musically to try to evoke this Parisian waltz kind of character. But to me, when I hear the main melody of Libiamo, my overall impression is still just Italian, and I think it's because it's such a famous melody and we associate it so closely with Verdi. You know, even though he's trying to make this sort of Parisian sound, it still at the end of the day sounds like a pretty Italian version of Paris. So what you can expect as we listen to this number, Alfredo, because he's the one who's giving the toast, he begins singing this drinking song. And then after Alfredo sings the first verse, then Violetta repeats the same melody, but with some new words. And then finally, after Alfredo and Violetta have sung it, then the chorus gets a turn. And then, so that's sort of the first part of the number, repeating that melody 3 times. And then in the second part, Alfredo and Violetta exchange little bits of the melody back and forth. And so over the course of this, they're kind of both staking their positions, you know, that Alfredo believes in love and trying to find, you know, your one true pairing and so on. And Violetta is, you know, trying to be as carefree and kind of nonchalant as possible. And so they kind of go back and forth a little bit. And then finally, at the very end of the number, they come together and sing together with the chorus. So we'll take a listen to Libiamo now. And again, I'll follow along with the score. If you're looking on your own, we're starting on page 18. And I have to warn you, the music in this number and some of the other numbers, it can get a little fast. So I'm going to try to keep up with the score as much as I can. And, you know, I would just advise you try to keep an eye on, you know, where the main melody is. You know, if you get a little bit lost, you can also listen for the text and follow along with the Italian text. So those are my tips to try to, you know, keep your place when you're looking at a score that's moving at a kind of fast clip. Okay, so here we go, Libiamo.
Viviamo negli eti calici che la bellezza infiora e là fuggevo l'ora si n'avria voluta Oliviam nei dolci fremiti che suscita l'amore poiché quell'occhio alla cuore onnipotente va Libiamo, amore fra i calici più caldi baci avrà
Okay, now Violetta gets her turn.
si può
And now they'll trade back and forth.
Quando non savi ancora è il mio destin così non ti amo la piazza in canti quando bella è mio in questo paradiso sopra il mondo di
Okay. So we are going to continue on listening to Act One. I think this is just the very next number. Yep. So just going from page 28 to 29. So this next number consists of a waltz and a duet between Alfredo and Violetta. And I want to introduce here just a concept that is kind of helpful for thinking through what's happening in Traviata. It's also really helpful in general for analyzing how music is working, both in operas and also especially in film. And so that concept is called diegesis. So music in an opera or in a film tends to be either diegetic. So diegetic means that the music actually is taking place on stage in the opera itself, or non-diegetic, meaning that the characters are kind of not aware that there's music happening. So most of the time in opera, most of the music is non-diegetic. So that means, you know, it's a little bit of an illusion going on, right? The characters, the opera singers are singing, but the characters themselves are not really aware that there's music and singing going on. They, you know, from the character perspective, they're just talking. And that's one of the great illusions of opera, is this kind of, this tension between, we are hearing the singers, you know, sing their parts, but the characters kind of don't know that there's music going on. But Traviata breaks that mold, because there's a lot of music that's actually happening on stage that the characters are participating in. So the number we just heard, Libiamo, is a great example of that, because, you know, Alfredo actually says before the number he's going to sing this drinking song. So he knows he's singing, but sort of as the number goes on, the illusion starts to creep back in again. Like, are they all still aware that they're all still singing, you know, in real life? Uncertain. And this next number that we're going to listen to is an even better example of that. So throughout this number, the orchestra is acting like a band that's in the background at the party. So the waltz that we get, you know, is diegetic, right? It's happening in the actual staging, in the actual opera. So the characters are hearing this band playing a waltz in the background. But then the characters themselves, when they're singing, that's non-diegetic. They, you know, they're just being themselves and saying their lines. They kind of don't realize they're singing. So there's a great tension throughout Traviata between the diegetic music, the music that's definitely occurring on stage in the reality of the characters, and then the non-diegetic music that the characters are singing. So that's just something, you know, I hope it's not kind of too confusing, but it's something that's particularly interesting to think about in Traviata, because the lines so often in this opera are blurred between the diegetic and the non-diegetic. So in the beginning of this number, we get this waltz happening in the background, and Violetta and the chorus are both kind of singing along to the waltz that's being played by the band in the background. And we also get in this number the first signs of Violetta's illness. So she has a little bit of a coughing fit or something. You know, she kind of needs to sit down. And that's the first kind of sign that there's something wrong with Violetta. Alfredo, you know, comes to her rescue, tries to help her out, and he also tries to convince her that her lifestyle of going to party after party is going to be the death of her. And interestingly, as they get kind of deeper into conversation, their musical lines become more speech-like and less melodious. So I'll point out as we go through, there's one point where they actually get stuck just singing the same note, C, over and over and over again. And the music is really just being provided by the band, the orchestra in the background, and the characters themselves are almost speaking on stage. All right, so we're going to listen first to all of that, and then I'm going to take a little pause and introduce the duet that comes after this, this initial waltz.
Che ciò non gradireste ora le danze, anche te pensier, tutti accettiamo. Usciamo dunque. Piovete. Nulla. Che mai resta. Usciamo. Oddio. Allora, voi soffrite.
So Violetta is kind of suffering, and she tries to convince everyone else to keep partying. And so now again we hear the orchestra is going through playing this waltz in the background. And meanwhile, you know, you can imagine on stage, Violetta has sort of sat down, she's trying to recover, and she notices how pale she looks.
Cessata l'ansia che vi turbò. Sta meglio. A in cotal guisa ucciderete. Averve d'uopo cura dell'esser vostro.
So you can already hear now their vocal lines are very simple, very speech-like.
Pei vostri sabidi. Perché nessuno al mondo va, nessuno, tranne sol'io. È vero, sì, grande amor dimenticato via. Ridete, e involvo ancora.
And now they're singing just one single note.
Ma se ciò fosse, non potreste allora cegliar.
Lots of C's.
Io non vi inganno. Ah sì, da un anno.
Okay, so I'm just going to pause there. So we've just listened to that initial waltz in this number, and we're just about at the point where the duet is going to begin. So in this duet, Undi Felice, we get Alfredo's first declaration of love for Violetta. And Alfredo sort of starts off a little haltingly, you know, he's a little unsure what to say, but eventually his melody blossoms into this love theme, which is related to Violetta's love theme that we heard in the prelude. So just to give you a little sample of that, like I said, it comes up just a little bit after we get started. So this is on page 40 is when we get for the first time this love theme. So I'm just going to play you again, you know, that love theme from the beginning, from the prelude. And the love, so that's Violetta's love theme. And the love theme that we get here, which is really Alfredo's love theme, is similar to that, it's just a little different. Violetta's, Alfredo's. So very, very similar, just a slight little differences and little turns in the melody. Okay, so in the duet, Alfredo goes first. He declares his love for Violetta. We hear Alfredo's love theme for the first time, and it will come back several times in the opera. And after Alfredo, sings the love theme for the first time, the very next thing that happens is we actually get a little dip from, so far this number has been in major, it's been in F major, and we're actually going to get a little dip into minor. So we hear the melody. And then we get this little dip into minor. So again, just this little foreshadowing that things are going to go a little wrong and not be quite as happy as they seem right now. So anyway, so Alfredo sings his declaration of love, and then Violetta's response to Alfredo is to sing some of her most elaborate, most ostentatious, most ornamented, flirtatious music of the whole opera. So she basically rebuffs him and just tries to really show off. But after there's a little back and forth between the characters, they eventually come together and start singing just separated by the interval of the third, which is like kind of the sweetest, most consonant interval. So they start singing really together, and Violetta's defenses against Alfredo are clearly weakening. Okay, so let's take a listen to that whole duet, and I'll try to point things out again as we go on. And so we're just going to be starting at the bottom of page 39.
Felice eterea mi balenasta innante e da quel dì tremante visi bioto amor.
And here comes the love theme. Little minor moment. And now Violetta is going to be very flirty. And now they're singing together in thirds. Okay. So after we have that lovely duet, we hear Alfredo's love theme for the first time. He seems to be starting to maybe possibly wear down Violetta's defenses a little bit. We go back to the waltz music of the opening. Alfredo gets ready to leave, and Violetta gives him a flower and tells him to return when it wilts. So he interprets that as, being invited to return the next day. And so again, they trade off phrases, and this time we'll see that as they trade off phrases with each other, they are both rising in pitch. They're singing higher and higher in their ranges as their excitement grows. So just to contrast that with before, when it was really kind of more pedestrian and very speech-like, here we're really going to get this big blossoming into song as their excitement and love for each other kind of grows. Sorry, just give me 1 second.
Che ben, che diavol fate? Se panneggiamo! Sta ben, restate! Amor, dunque, non più piegar mal patto. Io v'obbedisco. Parto! Ma tal giungesti? Prendete questo fiore. Perché? Per riportarlo. Quando? Quando sarà passito. Oh ciel! Domani! Ebbene, domani! Io son felice! D'amor e di fortuna! Oh, quanto amo, quanto! Io son felice!
So their pitches keep going up.
Oh, quanto amo, quanto! Parto! Di più non bravo! Addio! Addio!
Okay. Okay, so moving on, after Violetta and Alfredo have said their goodbyes, Violetta is trying to sort out her feelings toward Alfredo, and so we get a pair of recitatives and arias where she's trying to kind of work out how she's feeling. So we're going to start by listening to her first aria in this scene, Forse. And so, we've talked already a little bit about the shifts between the minor and the major keys, and this aria really exemplifies it. So let me just pull up the score to where we'll be starting. So here we are, we're on page 59, just starting at the end of the second system. So you can see the key signature over here. We start off in F minor. So this initial section of the aria is in F minor. And then we're going to shift back to F major for the second section of the aria. And Violetta is actually going to sing Alfredo's love theme. So first, in the beginning of the aria, we'll have this F minor section. And then eventually, I'm just fast forwarding a little so you get a little preview, we'll get Violetta singing Alfredo's love theme. Okay, so we'll just listen to those first two sections of the aria just to save a little bit on time. Sorry, let me just fast forward a little. Okay, there we go. now we're gonna get the love theme. Okay, so that's just to give you a taste. That's the first part of the aria, and then those two sections basically repeat again. So after we get that aria, then Violetta has another little bit of recitative. And so, you know, in that aria that we just listened to, she's starting to realize her feelings for Alfredo, and she's starting to seriously consider, you know, is she falling in love with him and whatnot. And then the recitative that we get right after that, Violetta has a complete change of heart and declares that everything that she just said was nonsense, which she literally in Italian says folie, folie, you know, just nonsense, nonsense. And in this second recitative, we get some really impressive, very show-offy melismas, fioriture, etc., coming toward the end of this recitative. And then after this recitative, then we go straight into Sempre Libera, her second aria, which is, you know, one of the great Verdi soprano showpieces. So let's listen to the recitative, and then I think I'll pause again before we go into Sempre Libera. So we are going to just be fast forwarding through the score a little. And we'll pick up right here, right at the bottom of page 62. Okay, so right there, we're just coming to the end of the recitative, and we're about to launch into Sempre Libera. Just wanted to say a couple of words before we did. So like I said, this is one of the great, you know, Verdi showpieces for soprano. And basically, Violetta is declaring, you know, literally the translation of Sempre Libera means, you know, I will always be free. So Violetta is declaring that she'll always be free. She never wants to be kind of tied down to one man. You know, love is not for her, etc. And so we get just a huge amount of ornamentation in melismas. So what we heard just at the end of that recitative is just a little sample of what's going to come in Sempre Libera. But then partway through this aria, Alfredo interrupts in the background, and Alfredo comes in again singing, you know, his love theme for her. But Violetta, you know, tries to fight off her attraction to him. So let's keep listening, and we're now at the top of page 64.
Di gioia in gioia, o che scorre viver mio, e sentieri del piacer, nasce il giorno al giorno noia, sempre viva nei ritrovi. A dilettere sempre noi, e ballare il mio pensiero.
comes Alfredo with his love theme. Okay, so as you can see at the bottom of the score, that's taken us right through to the end of Act 1. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, Act 2 shifts ahead in time by a few months, and Alfredo and Violetta are living together in the Parisian countryside. But everything is not, 100% okay because they have very little money. And so while Alfredo is off trying to raise some money in Paris, his father, Giorgio Germont, comes and tries to convince Violetta to leave Alfredo. And the reasoning, again, just to remind you, is because it's impossible for Giorgio to marry off his daughter as long as there's kind of this stain on the family's reputation of Alfredo being off and living with this courtesan. So there's a whole series, the real sort of centerpiece of Act 2 is this very extended scene between Violetta and Giorgio as he's trying to convince her that she really must leave Alfredo. So we're going to listen to just a couple of excerpts of that. So first, we're going to start off, let me just get down here. So we're going to be starting on, I think this is page 90. We'll be starting on page 90 toward the bottom of the page with Giorgio's aria Un di quando le Veneri. So again, Giorgio is trying to convince Violetta. He's just trying another way. He's already tried to say a couple of things to get her to leave Alfredo, and here he's trying yet again. So this starts off in F minor, and then we're going to see, when Violetta kind of realizes partway through this number that she has no other choice than to go along with what Giorgio is saying, the key is going to shift to an even more minor, more remote key. It's actually going to go to the key of D flat minor. D flat minor is like a key that shouldn't even exist. it technically, to get into D flat minor, you not only go through all of the accidentals, you actually have to add an extra accidental. You have to add B double flat to get to D flat minor. So more commonly, you don't usually see things spelled out as being in D flat. Really, really unusual. You'd normally see the equivalent, the enharmonic equivalent of that, which is C sharp minor, which has only 3 sharps. So D flat minor has 8 flats, I guess you could say. It's really, really unusual. And I'm just pointing it out. Not only is it so unusual to see someone actually writing music that's in D flat minor, but this key is really significant because it actually foreshadows the very end of the opera, which is also set in D flat minor. So when Violetta kind of realizes she has no choice but to leave Alfredo, it kind of signifies that her life is over too, by foreshadowing the key that, you know, we're eventually going to hear when she dies. Okay, so let's take a listen to that, and I'll point out again when we get to D flat minor.
Ne siete in tempo ancor, ed io che ispiro giovine, ed io che ispiro giovine, ed io che ispira dai detti a un giorno.
And here's the move to D flat minor. You see these accidentals? And you can see, if you look at the left hand also, okay, so so I'm just going to stop there for now. If we had more time, then I would really love to keep listening to a little bit more of Giorgio and Violetta, but for the sake of time, I think we need to move on. So we're going to fast forward a little bit in Act 2 to the point when Alfredo comes home from Paris. Violetta has been convinced that she should leave Alfredo, and she was actually trying to write a letter to Alfredo saying that she was going to leave him, and Alfredo comes in and kind of interrupts her. So Alfredo enters, he's trying to figure out what she's up to. Violetta is very, very upset, and she keeps asking Alfredo if he loves her. And then she erupts into singing her love theme, so the love theme that we heard in the very beginning of the opera in the prelude. So we haven't actually heard that exact version before. We've heard Alfredo's love theme a bunch of times, and now we get to hear Violetta's love theme. And I'll point that out when we get to that moment in the scene. So we are just going to fast forward a little. And we're going to be starting here on page 105 at the top of the page.
Che fai? Scrivevi al turbamento, a chi scrivevi? Dammi quel foglio. Mi perdona, sono io preoccupato. Giunse mio padre.
Lo vedesti?
Ah no, severo scritto mi lasciava, però l'attendo, tamerà invenerti.
Mi sorprendo, lascia che m'allontani, tu lo calma, ai piedi suoi mi getterò, mi bese piano, mi vorrà, sarei felice, perché tu muovi, Alfredo, tu muovi, Alfredo, tu muovi,
Perché piangi?
di lagrime ovvero d'uomo, son tranquilla. Lo vedi, ti sorrido, lo vedi, son tranquillo, ti sorrido. Sarò là, tra quei fiori, presso che sempre presso che...
Okay, and here's the big build up. And here's that theme from the prelude. And Violetta runs off at the end of that scene. Okay. So now I want to fast forward again into Act 3. So as I said at the beginning of class, oh, actually, sorry, just one thing before I fast forward. I just want to point out in that number that we just heard, I hope that you were able to notice that Violetta's singing style had already changed a lot from the first act. So we still get quite a lot of high notes. Her singing is still very dramatic, but I hope you noticed there was not really any ornamentation. So we didn't get that kind of very flirtatious, fiorituri and extra melismas and things like that we heard in Act 1. So her vocal style is already getting simpler, even though it's still, very impressive and very emotional, very moving at this point. So with that said, we're now going to fast forward to Act 3 and see how her vocal style again just gets even that little extra bit subdued, refined as we move through the opera. So the passage that we're going to listen to from Act 3, like I said, Violetta in Act 3 is pretty much just on her deathbed. She's hours away from dying. And so in this scene that we're going to listen to, I'll just pull up the score here so you can see it. We're going to start off in a very remote key, again, a very, very heavily flat key. So we're starting off in the key of G flat major, which has 6 flats. Not quite as remote as D flat major, but still pretty remote. or D flat minor, I should say, but still pretty remote. And so in this section, what we're first going to hear is the strings are playing, very hushed tremolos, so really kind of setting this hushed, mysterious atmosphere. And we're going to hear the orchestra play Alfredo's love theme. And while the orchestra is playing that, Violetta reads out a letter that she's received from Giorgio Germont, from Alfredo's father. And so what she's recounting as she reads this letter out loud is that Alfredo has dueled with Violetta's protector, the Baron. The Baron was injured. Alfredo fled the country. Giorgio finally told Alfredo the real reason that Violetta had left him, and Alfredo was rushing back to try to see Violetta before she passes away. So we're going to hear that bit where she's reading the letter, and then after she reads the letter, then we're going to get into Violetta's aria. And this aria is another great example of the kind of minor-major dichotomy that we were talking about before. So it begins in A minor with a repeating kind of melodic figure with a very kind of halting accompaniment, maybe representing kind of Violetta's struggle to breathe. And in this minor section, Violetta is really kind of lamenting her fate and just how terribly things have gone. And then the second section of the aria switches from A minor into A major, and Violetta asks God to look kindly upon this Traviata. So Traviata means actually a fallen woman, right? So that's what Violetta would be, being a courtesan. And so she asks God to look kindly upon this Traviata, upon herself as she's dying, and to forgive her and to welcome her into heaven. Okay. So let's listen to that, and I'll point those things out again as we kind of get there. Okay. So again, we hear the violins are playing Alfredo's theme. And now she's reading that letter.
La disfida ebbe luogo. Il barone fu ferito, però migliora. Alfredo è in stranio suolo. Il vostro sacrificio io stesso gli ho svelato. Egli a voi tornerà per suo perdono. Io pur verrò. Curatevi, mertate un avvenir migliore. Giorgio Germont. È tardi. Attendo, mia me giungo mai. Come son mutata, ma il dottore aspirar pur deserto.
And there's a little hint of that death theme. And now we're going to get the start of that aria. So we're going to start off in A minor. And now we're going to get this shift to A major as she asks for forgiveness. And again, if we listened to the second half of the aria, we would hear that same pattern repeat. So we get again the shift back to A minor and Violetta just reflecting on how hopeless her situation is, followed by a shift back to A major as she again asks for forgiveness for La Traviata. Okay, so that about wraps up all the time that we have for today. I hope you've enjoyed this little journey through Traviata. And Mackenzie, if we have any final questions?
Yeah, it looks like we do. So if anyone has questions, feel free to share them in the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can. Our first question we have says, you mentioned that Verdi uses more than one theme that is repeated along the opera, but I had the impression that Alfredo's love theme is repeated many times, while Violetta's theme is sung few times in the prelude and at when she decided to leave Alfredo. Is there a reason for this?
That's a really great question. You are right that Alfredo's love theme definitely appears a lot more times than Violetta's, and the two are related, but they're not quite exactly the same. I think personally, just trying to like speculate on what the reason for this is probably has to do with the nature of each of their love. So, keep in mind, Alfredo from the very beginning, he's steadfast, right? He loves Violetta from afar. He's loved her for a year before he even tries to speak to her. He is constantly, especially in the first act, telling her how much he loves her. But Violetta's love, it's really hard for her to trust and to open herself up to love. And so I think the reason you hear her love theme less is, just a reflection of exactly that. It's hard for her to trust, and it's hard for her to put her whole heart into something. So I think that's why we hear her love theme less. But I also think that's why it's in the prelude, because really ultimately this opera is about Violetta's journey and how Violetta develops her feelings over the course of the opera. So I think, it's sort of a more important theme. I think Verdi probably puts it in the prelude for that reason, but he also saves it for key moments, to kind of reiterate that.
Great, thank you. We currently don't have any other questions. We'll wait a second and see if anything else comes up into the Q&A session. While we give it a moment, I'll actually just take this moment then and thank you all for joining us and remind you that we have been recording this session today. We will be uploading this recording to the Thinkific platform, and I'll be sending an email when it is uploaded. We do ask that you give us a little bit of time because we will be actually captioning this recording, and so the uploaded recording will have captions, and just to allow for time for that process, we're aiming that we'll have it up on Monday, and we'll email you again when it's available, and at that point it'll be continue to stay available for 72 hours. So at this point, it looks like we have no more further questions. So thank you, Dr. Perley, for leading us in this today. This was a really wonderful session, and thank you all for joining us from all over the world. Thank you again, and stay tuned for more courses, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone, for
Thank
joining.
you.
Bye. Have a great Saturday.